There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. Not in a dramatic way, not with noise or sparks. They arrive quietly. Sometimes they arrive with a look. My name is Lucas Menezes. I'm 24, and until a few months ago, I'd built my whole life around a single skill: not being seen. I'm not talking about shyness. That's not it. Shyness is something you can overcome. Therapy. Years of throwing yourself at people until it stops hurting. What I learned was different. More precise. A kind of strategic invisibility. Picking clothes that wouldn't draw attention. Answering questions with just enough to close the door before it opened. Smiling the right way at the right moment, so nobody got curious about what was behind it. I grew up in a religious family. The kind of house where certain topics had no name. Where possibilities got treated as non-existent. Where the solution to anything that didn't fit was simple. Don't let it fit. I got that logic early. There was something in me that didn't belong in those spaces. So I learned not to let it belong. I got so good at not fitting that it became a skill. When I finished business school and a contractor position opened at a military base in the interior of São Paulo, I saw exactly what I wanted. A perfect place to stay invisible. Military base, structured, codified masculinity, protocol, hierarchy, routine. A place where nobody asks personal questions. Personal doesn't fit the system. I could work, finish my contract, save money, and leave exactly like I came in. Perfect. I should have quit that day. Not the day I got the offer. The first day I was inside. Civilian clothes, briefcase, trying to memorize corridors. The first day I saw him. The problem? He saw me first. The base sits in São Paulo's interior far enough from any city that the late afternoon horizon is just red earth and open sky. I arrived Monday in August. Sun weak. Air dry and smelling of cement, diesel, discipline. Heavy steel gates. Guards checking paperwork like they're checking a bolt efficient. No judgment. Completely indifferent. I liked that. Then I crossed the central courtyard that first day, briefcase in hand, trying to look like part of the inventory. A voice cut across from the other side of the yard. Not the words, they were too distant. The tone. That specific authority that isn't asking, isn't suggesting, just declaring what is and expecting the world to reorganize around it. I looked. I shouldn't have. Sergeant Renato Cavalcante, 35. Shoulders that filled space with a certainty that only comes from a body trained to be an instrument. Not decoration. Impeccable uniform. Effortless posture. That rank stripe on his shoulder carrying the weight of someone who doesn't need to remind anyone what it means. His presence already says it. He was instructing 3 soldiers maybe 15 meters away. Not shouting. He didn't need to. The tone was low enough to demand attention, precise enough that ignoring it was impossible. Then he turned. And he saw me. It wasn't long. Not like the movies, no slow motion, no music shift. A second, maybe 2. His eyes dark brown, constantly evaluating, cataloging, deciding found me, lingered, then moved past like I was part of the inventory. But for that second, he saw me. For the first time in years, I was seen without choosing it. I turned and kept walking. Something shifted in the air in my chest, not exactly nervousness, more like recognizing a smell from somewhere I shouldn't know. I told myself it was first-day pressure, new environment, logistical adrenaline. I told myself that and believed it. I should have quit that day, but I didn't. And that's what I'm here to tell you about. The first week was an intensive, low-profile survival course. I worked in the administrative section documentation, filing, equipment reports, bureaucratic processes with no glamour and absolute importance. My supervisor was Lieutenant Ana Figueiredo. Early 40s, efficient, fair, no interest in subordinates' personal lives. My co-worker was Corporal Edson Ferreira. 28, tall, with that permanently sardonic expression of someone who's seen too much to fake surprise. Edson spoke little and observed everything. That was the impression in the first day's silence that wasn't hostile, but wasn't comfortable either. The silence of someone evaluating. And I, who'd spent my life evaluating others before being evaluated, recognized it with precise discomfort. Every time I entered, he'd lift his eyes from the desk, examine me a fraction of a second too long, then go back to work. I spent weeks reading that as a threat. I learned later that was just Edson. But here's the thing with invisibility. When you've spent your whole life waiting to be discovered, you start seeing it everywhere. Ever spend weeks with someone and only later realize you got it all wrong? Every gesture, every silence. Because you were so sure of what you'd find that you couldn't see what was actually there. I was about to learn I'd made that mistake with at least 2 people at the same time. The base environment was exactly what I expected. But expecting something and living it every day? Different things. There was a stiffness in the air, not just institutional. Cultural, ingrained, the way men greeted each other. How vulnerability got covered with pragmatism or aggressive humor. Hierarchy visible in tiny gestures. Who opened doors, who stood when someone entered. A world where softness was weakness, and weakness something to eliminate before it spread. I fit right in. The way I always had. A functional ghost. Efficient. Punctual. Protocol correct. Non-existent as a personality. On the 3rd day, Sergeant Cavalcante came in for documentation with Lieutenant Figueiredo. My back was to the door. I knew it was him by the weight shift. There are people like that, whose presence reorganizes everything before they speak. The other 2 servicemen straightened automatically. I got quieter, more organized at my desk, as if straightening papers mattered. He stayed 15 minutes. When he left, the room exhaled. I stared at paperwork longer than the task required. On the 5th day, he corrected me. An inventory report with a wrong date, a typo, a digit swapped. Lieutenant Figueiredo had already marked it in writing. But Sergeant Cavalcante, who apparently reviewed equipment reports, mentioned it in front of 4 soldiers there for something else, not raising his voice. No drama. He stated to the whole room that the administrative sector had processed a report with a date error, and that date errors in official documentation weren't minor mistakes. My face burned. I looked ahead, wrote the correction, confirmed it was done. On the 7th day, it was a filing protocol. On the 9th, it was a report format I had followed according to the manual, but not according to the base's specific preference. A distinction no one had explained to me, but one the sergeant made public anyway. 3 public corrections in less than 2 weeks. All accurate, all unnecessarily visible. There was something odd about how he did it. No anger in the corrections, none of that performative cruelty from someone wanting to hurt. More clinical. Like I was an efficiency problem to solve, not a person to diminish. Which made it strange because his corrections noticed me in a way Lieutenant Figueiredo's never had. When she corrected me in writing, I didn't exist beyond the error. When Renato corrected me aloud? Different. It was as if the precision of the correction said something about the attention he'd paid to what I did. I filed that observation nowhere, so I ignored it. I decided he had simply chosen me as the most convenient pressure point that month. That it was arbitrary. That it was impersonal. Edson was there for 2 of the 3. He said nothing. But I noticed, maybe this was the first time I realized Edson actually noticed things. That after the 2nd correction, he looked at me with something that wasn't pity or judgment. Closer to recognition. Like he was seeing something I didn't yet understand. I didn't understand the look. I kept working and kept my face smooth. I was almost right about the diagnosis. Completely wrong about the cause. In the 3rd week, a formal summons arrived. Via internal protocol, standard for notices. Sergeant Cavalcante requests the presence of contractor Lucas Menezes in his office at 2:30 p.m. to clarify discrepancy in administrative files for the period. I read it twice, then a 3rd time to make sure. Discrepancy, private office, 2:30. I spent the morning cataloging every document I'd touched in 15 days, trying to identify which one caused the problem. 3 likely candidates. I prepared them with explanatory notes, just in case. Edson was at his desk when I stood at 2:20 to leave. He didn't lift his head. But as I passed the door, he said, flat, "Good luck." I kept moving. His office was on the hall parallel to ours, closer than I expected, separated by doors most contractors never crossed. There was a photo next to the entrance, a woman smiling, a small child. Renato out of uniform, with a smile I'd never seen here. That made me pause for a second. The office door was closed. I knocked. I heard, "Come in," and entered. Small office. Functional. No ornaments except protocol required. Heavy metal desk with papers arranged precisely. Shelf with manuals and labeled binders. A visitor's chair. On the desk, left corner, a photo of family. The sergeant years younger, smiling a way that didn't exist in this room. He was standing when I came in, back to the window, reviewing a document. He didn't look up immediately. I stood, files under my arm, waiting. When he finally turned, it was deliberate. He sized me up, not with the hostility of public reprimands, but that analytical quality that seemed his default. Like the whole world was a document he was reviewing. "Menezes," he said. Not a question, a notation. "Sir." He pointed to the chair and returned to his. 20 minutes of document review. He asked precise questions. I gave precise answers. The discrepancy was real. A registration number assigned to 2 different documents at different times, creating duplication that complicated tracking. Not specifically my mistake, but an inconsistency predating my arrival that I'd perpetuated by processing new files without checking history. He listened, asked 2 more questions, checked another record, wrote something. No public correction, no humiliation, just information and what to do with it. A 12-minute administrative meeting about file processing, technically indistinguishable from any other meeting at that base. That threw me more than any earlier reprimand. I'd come prepared to defend myself. Spent the morning building arguments, gathering evidence, anticipating objections. I'd arrived wearing armor, and Sergeant Cavalcante just didn't attack. He reviewed documents with his usual exactness, asked questions about the issue, not me, and closed with the same clinical neutrality he'd started with. I didn't know what to do when armor wasn't necessary. While he wrote, there was silence, the kind that exists in closed spaces when 2 people are acutely aware of each other and neither speaks. I looked at the desk, the documents, the photo in the corner. I shouldn't have looked at that photo. When he finished, he said, "You can go." I stood, took my files, heading for the door when he said, not looking up, "The unit needs competence, Menezes, not excuses. The distinction matters. Not praise, not insult. A statement, the kind that doesn't invite response because it closes before you open your mouth." "Understood," I said, and left. In the corridor, Edson was there, not waiting, more like someone who'd been passing and stopped for an unspoken reason. He looked at me. That expression I couldn't read: assessment, curiosity, something more specific I wasn't ready to catalog. Then he looked ahead and kept walking, like he'd only paused for a second before continuing. I stared down the empty corridor too long. Ever tried so hard not to feel something that you felt it exactly because you were trying? That's how it works. You build the wall with such attention that attention becomes the feeling. I returned to my workstation carrying that like a physical thing, heavy, inconvenient, impossible to set down. I spent the following days hoping it'd pass. It didn't. The storage facility was on the northern perimeter, a records warehouse leaning against the fence marking the base boundary, away from the central area, rarely staffed. Documents there were from before digitization equipment reports, maintenance logs, historical docs that needed to exist but nobody consulted. I was sent there alone on a Friday, 2 weeks after being called in, to retrieve physical files from maintenance. Almost 3 p.m. Sun, heavy. August heat turning the air thick and still. Warehouse with shelves floor to ceiling, organized by year and department, smelling of old paper and closed space. I started with the first row on the list, locating folders by labels, confirming registration numbers, mechanical work, quiet. The kind I did well because it needed only attention and method. I was in the 3rd row when the warehouse door opened. No administrative reason for anyone else. I was the only one with a request that afternoon. So when footsteps entered with that cadence steady, unhurried, weight distributed like someone who knows where they're going, I knew before I saw him. Sergeant Cavalcante appeared at the end of my row. He stopped. We looked at each other. "Sergeant," I said. Nothing else to say. He didn't explain. Didn't invent a reason. Just entered the row parallel to mine and scanned the shelves, like he was looking for something, like I wasn't there. I worked in silence. He did the same, on the other side of the metal rack. Warehouse small enough to hear folders move, his steady breathing, his uniform friction against the metal when he shifted. This silence was different from all our previous silences. The office had formality to contain it. The department had other people to dissolve it. The courtyard had open space. The warehouse had none of that. Just cold metal, the smell of old paper, and two men pretending they had reason to be there. I knew he knew I knew. That shared, unspoken awareness, present in the warehouse air like something tangible, was scarier than any direct confrontation. Then he needed something from the high shelf on my side. He crossed without announcing it, stood to my left, reached his arm over me to grab a box on the top shelf. And for 1 second, for one movement, I was in the space between his arm and his body. His warmth perceptible. The smell of clean uniform and something else that had no name. He took the box, stepped back. I hadn't moved. Neither of us said anything. The warehouse silence was different. No formality to contain it. Just silence. The two of us. The shelf between us. His hand on the box, mine on a folder. Less than 6 inches apart. He did nothing. I did nothing. Nothing happened. And that destroyed me. I walked back across the courtyard with sun on my neck and something unnamed settling between my stomach and chest. It felt like the realization that a wall had been left behind in the warehouse. Ever want something you knew you couldn't have, not because it was wrong, but because your world had no room for it? No name, no place, no version of yourself that could hold it. That was the gap I was living in, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. In that moment, with the clarity of someone watching something inevitable approach, I understood I had a serious problem. 3 weeks later, Friday. The wing emptied early holiday eve. Everyone had asked to leave. By 6 p.m., just me and 2 military personnel. They left one by one. Edson left at 6:15, nodding like always. I was alone with the sound of my typing. Finished at 6:40. Was packing when the corridor door opened and Renato entered. No folder. No request. Just him. End-of-day uniform. Looking at me across the empty space with an expression I'd never seen here. Menezes. Sergeant. He walked to the center, looked at the wall clock, then at me. You finished. Not a question. I finished. Come. He didn't say where. Didn't wait for an answer. Turned and walked toward the back, not the exit. The opposite direction. Toward the locked records room I'd passed hundreds of times without reason to enter. I stood for a moment. The part of me that survived 24 years cataloged it. Empty wing, corridor with no camera, protocol broken, wrong direction, no administrative reason. That part said, calm, don't go. I grabbed my jacket and went. He had the key. The room required specific access, and he had clearance. He took the key from his pocket. Stood in front of the door for 1 second, hand on the lock, not moving. I saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. Then he turned the key. Click. Darkness opened, which he dispelled with a ceiling lamp. I went in. The door closed. Small room. Physical files both sides. A work table in the center unused. Weak lamp casting everything amber and shadow. Silence. Not managed silence from an office or wing. Real silence of a closed place where the outside world didn't reach. He stood on the other side of the work table. Looked at me. For the first time since I arrived, his expression wasn't that of a superior assessing a subordinate. It was closer to the look of a man who'd made a decision after fighting it long. I won't describe what happened in details that aren't mine to tell. But I'll say what that silence meant. The key turning mattered more than anything after. It was when pretense stopped. When two sides of something that had existed for weeks finally admitted it. There was a moment when he said my name. Just that. Lucas. No, the contractor. No formality. Just my name in a voice I'd never heard, which needed nothing else to be completely clear. I left afterward. Not together. That was understood. Didn't need saying. I crossed the corridor alone. Building completely empty. Emergency light casting orange end-of-shift glow that made spaces feel different, more candid, like the day let its guard down. When I reached the exit, I was something different. Edson was leaning against the wall outside. When I came out, he looked to the side. Our eyes met. He gave a nod. Light, almost imperceptible. Then he looked at the courtyard like nothing happened. I kept walking. There was a new weight between my stomach and chest. Not exactly fear, but flavored with the sense that something was about to change. What did that nod mean? I didn't know. Spent the next week trying to decode it. Did Edson see something? Suspect something? Calculate something? Was the nod protection? Warning? Just a man being polite by reflex? No way to know. And not knowing, I learned, is its own torture. Wednesday night, 2 weeks later. The sergeant's quarters were in a separate block, but there was legitimate administrative flow document delivery. Signature verification. I'd been there for legitimate reasons before. That night? Legitimate reasons. And other reasons. The quarters had private rooms, one of the few privacy concessions the hierarchy allowed. I knocked. He opened. For more than an hour, the rest of the base didn't exist. Then, while I was still there, footsteps in the corridor stopped outside, and the doorknob moved. He didn't move. Remained exactly where he was, immobile in a way that was both discipline and command. The door opened. A young soldier 18, 19 stopped in the doorway. Looked at him, looked at me. Stood there for a second too long. Faraz. Renato's voice came out intact, completely neutral. The contractor was delivering protocol documents for the week. He's done. You may go. Menezes. Yes, Sergeant. I took the folder I'd brought, which did indeed contain documents, by providence that felt prophetic, and passed the soldier Faraz without looking him in the face. Went down the corridor, down the stairs, crossed the courtyard back to the contractor's quarters. My temples pounded with a precision I hadn't asked for. That night I understood what we were risking. Not just me, though I was most vulnerable. The civilian without rank, without protection, disposable. But him. Everything he'd built. The rank, the reputation, the years of discipline for a role that didn't allow what he was privately. The family in the photo on his desk. The rank insignia. The way military straightened when he entered. All in the line of fire. All of it depended on an 18-year-old named Faraz who'd opened a door without knocking and lingered a second too long before accepting the explanation. Fear that night was no longer abstract. Before the warehouse, before the locked room, fear was fog. Vague possibility of undefined consequences. Manageable because it had no specific shape. What I felt that night had shape. It had the name of a soldier. The age of 18. The particular sound of a doorknob turned from inside out. Concrete was frightening in a way that killed my sleep that week. Ever wait for a consequence you don't know when or if it'll arrive, and realize waiting's harder than the consequence would be? That's what concrete fear does. Doesn't resolve, just exists. You coexist with it. Every time your phone rings or someone calls you down the hall, your stomach drops an inch before you realize it's something else. I spent that week like that, waiting. In the days after, Renato disappeared. Not literally. He was at the base, doing his duty, crossing the courtyard like always. But to me, a switch flipped. The complicit silence got replaced by something colder institutional distance I'd recognized at the start, but now knew was deliberate, not natural. Tuesday after that night, he corrected me publicly. Harder than before. 8 people soldiers passing through, nothing to do with the administrative section. Now heard Sergeant Cavalcante describe in precise detail how a report had wrong formatting and how that represented basic administrative incompetence. The report wasn't wrongly formatted. I'd checked it 3 times. I sat through it. Upright. Neutral expression. Eyes fixed ahead. Heard every word with volume turned down. Like drowning pain with another thought. I said, "Understood, Sergeant. The way you say it when you're deciding what to do with what you feel." Edson said nothing, but I saw, corner of my eye, he turned his head slightly for a second before going back to work. That night I went back and opened my laptop, wrote a resignation letter. Good letter. Professional, grateful, No drama. 3 paragraphs. Personal reasons. Opportunity in another area. The sentences that exist for when truth isn't an option. Read it 3 times. Part of me knew the letter was right. The part that had spent 24 years being precise about self-preservation, knew exactly the cost of staying, did the math, found the result clean and unambiguous. That part said, send it. Now. Before you do another calculation. I thought of my family, the house I grew up in, the learned silence, possibilities with no name. I'd spent 24 years building a life precisely so I wouldn't sit at a computer at 11 writing resignation letters, because I'd stayed past safe. The plan worked perfectly for 24 years and found the one environment that could make it obsolete in 2 months. But there was another part younger, scarier, not yet named, looking at the letter, thinking of a locked room with amber light. A silent warehouse and 15 centimeters. A nod in a hallway I hadn't decoded. I closed the document without sending. Closed the laptop. Went to sleep not knowing if I'd made the right decision, or if I was making the mistake I'd only recognize later. 2 days later, I found him on the perimeter. I had a habit of walking to the fence in late afternoon, the only space with a horizon, where you could look beyond the walls and remember there was a world out there. A small ritual I needed. He was there. What surprised me wasn't the presence, it was how he was. Jacket open at the top, vest loose, posture different from what I'd associated with his body here. No visible rank insignia. Not Sergeant Cavalcante correcting reports. Just a 35-year-old man standing at the fence edge, looking at the open field. He didn't pretend there was an administrative reason. I didn't ask for one. We stood side by side for a time that had nothing professional about it. Sun lowering, air colder in that corner. Then he said, 12 years in this institution. Sergeant for 6. A pause. I shouldn't have done what I did in the meeting. Not an excuse, not a plea. A statement, the kind he used in the sector, but different in every way that mattered. Quiet for a few more seconds. Then, discipline instructors don't. He stopped, started over, like someone trying a door, finding it locked, looking for another entrance. I built everything I have here a specific way, not an accident. Silence. I know what I did in that meeting, he said. I know it wasn't fair. I understood without him saying it directly. The hardness in the first months protected him. The coldness after 4th month was the same mechanism, faster, more force, because it had to be. But it failed. Not from weakness. Because something no longer fit inside it. Something that existed with or without the 12 years and insignia and photo on his desk. He wasn't apologizing, wasn't declaring anything. He was giving me a fact he'd held too long and that became too heavy to keep. The kind of thing you only say when you've decided the cost of not saying is greater than saying a decision made alone, without consulting anyone, following only his logic. I looked at the field beyond the fence while he spoke. Red earth, sky darkening, fireflies from the distant town appearing on the horizon, concrete, simple things completely unaware of everything happening between 2 men by a fence on the perimeter of a military base in the interior of São Paulo. I should have felt relief. That's what I'd expected. Confirmation that what I'd lived through was real on both sides. But what I felt was terror. Because before, when I thought it might be one-sided, there was a way out. A way to convince myself it'd pass, I'd forget. I could become invisible again. Now he'd taken that away. And I wasn't ready for what was in its place. He finally looked at me. Long enough to be honest, without the institutional layer, without the built distance, without calculated precision. Just 2 men on a gravel path at dusk, holding the weight of what was true between them. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back along the gravel. I stood near the fence long after he disappeared. Sun finished setting. The base emitted its nighttime noises generators, distant voices somewhere, metal on metal somewhere in the yard. The future was completely opaque. But something had changed, and I felt it with the same clarity I felt the gravel chill under my feet. No turning back. I returned by the longer route unhurried, letting the base resume its noises around me. Generators, voices, boots on concrete. Like I needed time to relearn that the world kept functioning exactly the same. even if something inside me was no longer in the same place. The complaint arrived Monday morning, not to me, to the base commander. I learned through third parties, the way the air changed in the wing that day. 2 closed meetings back to back in an office off the main corridor. The word going around quietly, in corners, with the care you take talking about things that explode, was anonymous complaint. Irregular behavior between a civilian contractor and a senior officer. Vague enough not to be a crime. Specific enough to require institutional response. The commander opened a preliminary inquiry, not formal yet, but the kind that precedes one if things aren't resolved satisfactorily. Lucas Menezes and Sergeant Renato Cavalcante would be heard separately. Same day, different rooms. What Renato would say, I had no control. And that powerlessness, having made an irreversible choice without knowing what he'd do with his half, was the scariest thing I'd ever felt. I was questioned first. A meeting room I'd walked past hundreds of times without entering. Rectangular table, office chairs, window with closed blinds that turned afternoon light into parallel stripes. The officer was a lieutenant I didn't know. No history with me or Renato. Notepad and pen, and a presence that told me he'd done this before. He started with questions about my role, contract length, routine interactions with base personnel. Then got more specific. Nature of my contact with Sergeant Cavalcante, frequency, context of each interaction I could recall. Then at a certain point, the lieutenant put his pen down and looked at me. Menezes, do you understand that any report I forward will determine the next steps? If your relationship with Sergeant Cavalcante was strictly professional as expected given your roles, then there's nothing to investigate. Your contract renews with a positive evaluation. A pause. I need you to tell me, clearly, what was the nature of your relationship with Sergeant Cavalcante? The institutional clock read 10:42. I could hear my breathing. The lieutenant's pen sat motionless, waiting. He was giving me a way out. I could see it. Deny everything, walk away clean, maybe keep a good review, slip back into invisibility, the plan from the start. You can do this, Lucas. You spent 24 years being good at that. I thought about the shortcut at the fence, the open jacket, missing insignia, the voice that said my name in a locked room like my name deserved to be spoken. I thought about the 24 years before. The silence I'd built as protection that over time became the only thing I inhabited. What it felt like realizing the silence was bigger than me, not armor. Just an empty space I filled with absence. The nature of my relationship with Sergeant Cavalcante went beyond the strictly professional, I said. The pen moved. He asked what he needed to ask. I answered what I needed to answer. No unnecessary details, no drama, no minimizing. When he finished, he dismissed me with the neutrality of someone who had more rooms that afternoon. I left and went to the corridor. Stopped by the window at the end. A sparrow on the sill or a different one, impossible to tell. Stared at it while air in my lungs returned to normal. I'd made an irreversible choice. Said something that couldn't be unsaid, now existing in an official record inside an institution that had no vocabulary for it. No way of knowing what had come. Renato would be heard next. Another room, another officer. I'd have no way of knowing what he said until consequences arrived, if they arrived. What form, what they'd carry. The base kept running. Mess hall serving dinner. 2 servicemen crossed the corridor discussing a duty roster without looking. Longest afternoon I've ever endured. What does a man who built 12 years of institutional identity say when the institution asks him directly? I didn't know. Only knew what I'd said. Had to live with it while I waited to learn what he'd done. Days after the hearing were the strangest I'd experienced. The base remained the same protocols, formations. Edson at his desk, Lieutenant Figueiredo with the same efficiency. I processed documents, filed reports, arrived early, left on time. Outside, I was exactly the same functional ghost. Inside, I was waiting. Nothing else to do. Every morning I arrived not knowing if that'd be the day someone came with an official notice. Every time Lieutenant Figueiredo called me, my stomach tightened for a fraction of a second before logic said it was about work. Every crossing with Renato in the corridor, institutional distance intact, his face giving nothing, was a new version of the same unanswered question. What had he said in that room? The inquiry was closed for lack of evidence. The anonymous report wasn't corroborated by statements collected. The case was filed away with no formal disciplinary measures. I learned this from the internal memo circulating through the wing a week later, written in bureaucratic language that leaves no room beyond what needs to be said. What Renato said, I learned that later. Not from him, from Corporal Edson Ferreira, Wednesday afternoon when the wing was nearly empty. He came to my station with his usual folder and stood there for a moment before speaking. That specific Edson moment. The pause of someone weighing words against silence and deciding words win. "Sergeant said you were good at the job," Edson said. "That the interaction was strictly administrative. That any different perception was a misinterpretation of protocol by whoever filed the report." I stood there, processing. What Renato done was technically the course that protects the institution, protects a career, denies what can't be publicly confirmed. But there was a difference Edson communicated even using the words of a formal statement. Renato protected me, constructed the narrative so I came out unscathed, not thrown under the bus like would have been easy, the simplest response for someone protecting 12 years of institutional construction. The most limited choice available within an institution that has no room for the other choice. Yet it was a choice, and I could read it. "Edson," I said. Who filed the report?" He looked at me with that characteristic moment too much time before answering. "I don't know," he said. I kept looking. Edson returned my gaze with that expression I'd never quite deciphered, neither confirmation nor denial. Just the weight of a man knowing more than he's saying, waiting to see what I'd do with it. I didn't press. Then he said something else. I found out weeks ago. His voice was low, not exactly discreet. More someone stating what he'd decided to say, and not asking approval. The report was filed by Private Ferraz. He went to Lieutenant Barracks first before the commander. I found out before Barracks forwarded it up. I stared at him. "I had a conversation with Ferraz," Edson continued, "about what happens to reports without enough corroboration, about the difference between what you think you saw and what you can prove." A pause. He decided not to proceed with additional details when the lieutenant called him. I understood what he was telling me. That he'd intervened. Not illegally, nothing illegal in what he described. But he'd made a decision, alone, weeks earlier, without telling me. Without asking anything in return. He'd spent weeks knowing exactly what was happening and decided what to do with that knowledge in a way nobody'd asked for or expected. "Why?" I said. Edson looked at me for a moment. Those eyes that lingered too long on things, which I'd spent months reading as threat and now saw differently. "Because it seemed like the right thing to do," he said. That was it. No further explanation. No drama. No assertion of virtue. Like the answer needed no ornament because it was simply the most straightforward truth available. Then he went back to his workstation with the folder he'd brought. The conversation closed the way he'd decided it was closed. I kept staring at the empty desk for a long time. All those looks from Edson I'd spent weeks decoding. Every lingering too long I'd read as surveillance, threat, the weight of someone cataloging information to use later. It had been exactly the opposite. The look of someone who knew and decided, without consulting anyone, without seeking validation, that knowing didn't obligate him to do anything with it. Things you can't prepare for. Private Ferraz opening a door. Renato at dusk with his insignia missing. And Edson Ferreira, 28. Corporal sardonic observer who spent 2 months seeming like a threat, and who'd been, the whole time, the only person on the base who knew everything, and decided alone, that it wasn't his decision to make. I'm narrating this now, months later. I know you want to know if it was worth it, whether the ledger balanced. But that's not the right question, because what I discovered is, some things aren't about balancing accounts. The inquiries filed. The contract renewed. Private Ferraz was transferred. Corporal Edson's still exactly where he was, watching more than speaking, with that look that lingers before moving on. We didn't talk about that conversation. Didn't need to. And Renato. Renato and I exist in a space that has no institutional name and no guaranteed safety. The insignia went back to his jacket. The public distance is intact in the wing, in the yard, anywhere there are eyes. The photo's still on his desk. The world he built over 12 years keeps existing, because it had to continue. Because there's no other version available within what's possible now, but what exists between us exists. In the gaps. In the spaces between spoken words. In times when the bass is quiet enough to be something else. It isn't a love story as told, no resolution, no home, no future you can plan. It has the real weight of two men who made irreversible choices within a structure that doesn't recognize them as valid, and the weight of two people who chose not to deny what was true when they could have, and who live, each in his own way, with what that choice means. I don't have a tidy ending. Didn't turn this into a public statement. Didn't resolve anything definitively. Don't leave this as someone certain about what comes next. Don't have the answers you want. But I still walk past the fence every evening on my way home. Still pause for a moment near the lone tree before moving on. And sometimes I think about that first day steel gates, uniforms, the smell of diesel and discipline. Me with the contract folder in my hand, being shown around. The moment my eyes met his across the yard. The way I thought that day, invisible, routine, secure work. The perfect plan for someone like me. I should have quit that day. But I don't regret not quitting, and that sentence, which seems like a contradiction, is the most honest thing I have to say. Would have been simpler, safer, less complicated. The future remains uncertain. The base is still a world with its own rules. Rank insignia still matter, but what I understand now, what I didn't on that first day, is it wasn't about surviving. Never was. For 24 years, I learned invisibility because I believed being seen was the danger. If someone saw what lay beneath the silence, the routine, the chosen invisibility, they'd have reason to fear me. The only way to be safe was making sure nobody had enough access to hurt me. And then he saw me, from across a courtyard on an August afternoon, with no declared intention, just eyes sweeping a space and settling where I was. He saw me not because I'd made the mistake of appearing, just because I was there. To be seen by someone fleeing the same thing. To be recognized by someone understanding viscerally the cost of existing inside a system that has no room for who you are. To be found not by accident, but by the convergence of two specific kinds of invisibility that together created the only visibility that mattered. That doesn't make things simple. Nothing that happened did. The foundation's still what it is. Institutions still have their laws. The future still has no map. Some days the weight of this, the uncertainty, the necessary distance, the choices that can't be undone, is exhausting without quick escape. But there are other days. What I've learned is the silence I'd built wasn't protecting me, was erasing me. Huge difference between the two, even if when you're inside it, it's almost impossible to notice. To be seen, after a lifetime of the opposite, was the most dangerous thing that ever happened to me. It's also the only thing I wouldn't undo. If you're carrying something you've never named, a silence grown too large, a version of yourself you learned to hide so well you sometimes forget, I want you to know this story didn't end neatly. But it ended honestly. And there are days when honest's enough. If this touched something you recognize, if there's something in what I lived that resonates, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. I needed someone to see me. Maybe you do too. Until the next story.